He paid a dying man's debt in raw silver coin, and she believed with every frightened bone in her body that she had been sold to a monster. She had no idea he had been carrying her name in his chest like a splinter for 11 years. The autumn of 1883 came to the Ozark foothills of southern Missouri with the smell of rot and early frost. For Everett and May Callum, the season brought nothing new. Only the same creeping arithmetic of ruin that had been grinding them down since the flood of '81 had swallowed their cornfields and half their livestock in a single black night. Their farm, a small and stubborn collection of timber frame buildings perched above the Gasconade River basin, had never fully recovered. The soil was still too wet in the low places, too compacted in the high ones, and the mule they had borrowed money to replace had gone lame by July. The man holding their debt was named Cornelius Fitch. Fitch operated out of the river town of Gartzklun's Crossing, where he kept a tidy office above a dry goods store and a reputation for patience that was, in truth, nothing more than the careful timing of a trap. He had extended the Callum family's notes twice already, each extension adding a new layer of interest that Everett could not calculate and Fitch would not clearly explain. Now it was October, the grace period had ended, and Fitch had come to collect. Accompanied by two men whose only job, as far as anyone could tell, was to stand behind him with their thumbs hooked in their gun belts. Everett stood in the door of the farmhouse with his hat in his hands. May sat inside by the window, her breathing shallow and wet, the consumption having taken up permanent residence in her lungs sometime around midsummer. Their daughter, Phoebe, stood beside her mother, with one hand resting on the older woman's shoulder, watching through the warped glass. Phoebe Callum was 22 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had spent the last 3 years doing the work of two people while her father's back slowly gave out and her mother's lungs slowly surrendered. She was not a soft woman by that point. The prairie had seen to that. But she was not yet the woman she was about to become. Fitch's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "Everett, I've been more than reasonable. The note is $430. I want the land or I want the money. I'll give you until sundown." Everett's voice was barely audible. "The harvest was poor, Mr. Fitch. If you could see your way to spring." "I cannot." Fitch pulled out a folded document and held it up. "What I can offer is this. I have a business associate in St. Louis who requires household management. A capable young woman, contract of 4 years, wages applied directly to your balance. Your daughter fills that role, and your debt is cleared." The silence that followed lasted long enough for a crow to call twice from the elm tree at the edge of the yard. May's hand found Phoebe's wrist and gripped it. Phoebe had heard enough men like Fitch in enough towns to know what a 4-year household contract meant when offered by a man with 2 armed escorts. It was not housekeeping, it was a slow erasure. She was still working through what her father would say, whether he was strong enough to refuse, when the sound came from the road. It was the sound of a single horse moving at an unhurried walk, heavy hooves, deliberate pace. The man who rode into the Callum yard on that gray October afternoon did not look like anyone Phoebe had ever seen outside of a nightmare or a dime novel, and not in a way that was entirely comfortable. He rode a tall iron-gray, thoroughbred cross, the kind of horse that took years to earn. The rider himself was broad across the shoulders, dressed in a dark canvas duster over worn leather, with a flat-crowned hat pulled low. A Springfield rifle rested across his saddle. He had a week's worth of beard on his jaw and river mud on his boots, and he looked at Cornelius Fitch the way a man looks at a fence post he is about to pull out of the ground. His name was Caden Voss. In the counties along the upper Gasconade, people spoke of him the way they spoke of old storms, as something that had happened and left a mark. He had spent the last decade working as a boundary surveyor and land assessor for the Federal Land Office, living out of a canvas pack between jobs and a rented room in Garland's Crossing between territories. He came down from the hill country twice a year, traded his survey notes for wages, and disappeared again. He was not a man who accumulated things. He was a man who moved through the world, leaving very little trace, which made the next thing he did all the more arresting. He reached into the inside pocket of his duster and produced a cloth envelope. He held it out to Fitch without dismounting. "Count it," he said. His voice was flat and certain, the kind of voice that did not expect to repeat itself. $430, silver certificates and coin. The Callum debt is discharged. Fitch took the envelope with the expression of a man who had bitten into something unexpected. He opened it, rifled through the contents, and his jaw tightened. The amount was correct. He looked up at the rider with something approaching fury and managed to dress it in a thin smile. "And what exactly does Mr. Voss expect in return?" Caden looked across the yard to the farmhouse window. For just a moment, a single quiet second, his eyes found Phoebe's through the glass. She could not read his expression. It was closed and still, like a door with no handle. "The girl comes with me," he said, "as my wife. The debt is paid in full, and you have no further business on this property." Inside the farmhouse, the floor seemed to tilt. May's grip on Phoebe's wrist tightened to the point of pain. Everett made a sound that was not quite a word. Fitch looked between the rider and the farmhouse, with the calculating expression of a man running numbers he didn't like, and then he pocketed the envelope, tipped his hat without warmth, and gestured to his men to follow him back down the road. Caden Voss dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked to the farmhouse door. He was taller than Phoebe had realized. He filled the doorframe the same way a stone wall fills a gap, completely. He did not look at her with hunger or possession. He looked at her with something she could not name, something old and heavy and carefully contained. "Pack what you need," he said quietly. "We ride north before dark. I have a cabin in the hill country above Repton Creek. You'll have your own room, a door with a bolt, and enough provisions to last the winter." He paused. "I won't lie to you and call it a good arrangement, but it is a safer one than what Fitch was offering." Phoebe looked at her mother. May's eyes were wet, but her chin was steady. "Go," May said softly. "Go, Phoebe." Phoebe packed her coat, her boots, her father's old cartridge case, and the small wooden box in which she kept her mother's sewing needles. She did not let herself look back at the farmhouse as they rode out of the yard. If she had, she was not certain she would have been able to keep riding. They traveled north for 3 days through the Ozark Hill country, the terrain rising and thickening around them as they climbed. Caden Voss set a pace that was steady without being punishing, and he said almost nothing. He stopped without being asked when the trail grew steep, helped her across the rocky creek crossings without comment, and at night built a fire large enough to be warm, but not large enough to be visible from the valley roads. Phoebe watched him the way she might watch an unfamiliar animal near a water source. Not with panic, but with the kind of careful attention born of genuine uncertainty. He gave her no reason for fear. He also gave her very little reason for anything else. He was simply there, moving through the world with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been entirely self-reliant for a long time. On the second night, the temperature dropped sharply. She had her coat, but the wind off the ridge cut through it, and she sat hunched near the fire, with her arms wrapped around herself. She did not ask for anything. It did not occur to her that she could. He stood up, crossed to his saddlebag, and returned with a heavy wool blanket, the kind issued to surveyors working federal contracts in winter elevation. He set it around her shoulders without ceremony, as though it were simply the logical next thing to do, and returned to the other side of the fire. "Thank you," she said. "Keep it on," he replied. He did not look up from the small journal he had opened in his lap. "The ridge will be colder tomorrow," she watched him write. His handwriting was careful and close. Survey notations, she thought, measurements and markers, the language of a man who spent his life recording where things were and how far apart. The cabin above Repton Creek was not what Phoebe had prepared herself to find. She had braced for a trapper's hovel, a dirt floor, a sagging roof, the smell of old pelts and neglect. What she found instead was a well-kept two-room log structure with a stone chimney, a plank floor swept clean, and a cast-iron stove that Cadden had the fire going in before the horses were fully unsaddled. There was a sleeping room with a cot and a wool quilt. There was a kitchen room with a dry larder, a water barrel, and hooks on the wall where iron pots hung in neat order. She stood in the center of the front room and looked around. He set her bag by the door to the sleeping room. "The bolt's on the inside," he said simply, and then went back out to stable the horses. She slid the bolt the first night, and the second. On the third night, she did not, though she could not have explained precisely why. The days that followed were strange in their ordinariness. He was gone most mornings before she woke, out on survey, runs into the timber with a transit and a chain, marking land boundaries for a federal contract that had kept him in the hill country since August. She learned to find breakfast in the larder and to keep the stove fed. She learned which of the boards on the porch creaked in the cold and how to bank the fire at night so it held till morning. He returned each evening with the smell of pine resin and cold air on his coat, and he ate whatever she had thought to cook without comment or complaint. And he sat across from her at the small table in the dim light and spoke when spoken to, and otherwise was quiet. She asked him about his work. He told her, carefully and without embellishment, about the business of land measurement. He told her about the error rates in old Spanish land grants, the way rivers shifted their courses over decades, and invalidated half the surveys done before 1860, the way a quarter-inch mistake in a baseline could mean 40 acres of disputed property by the time the chain reached a township boundary. She did not know why she found this interesting. She did. One evening in the second week, she was tidying the shelf above the stove when her hand found something tucked behind a tin of salt and a candle box. It was a small object, smooth from handling, made of dark walnut wood. She drew it out and held it up to the firelight. It was a child's top, a spinning top, the kind carved by hand, with a narrow stem and a rounded body. Someone had burned a ring of small stars around its widest point with a hot nail. The craftsmanship was careful, patient. It was the kind of thing a person made for someone specific. Phoebe turned it in her fingers. A memory moved through her like cold water. She was 11 years old, sitting on the steps of her family's church in the town of Dunning, Missouri, after the Sunday service. A boy had been sitting on the fence across the road, older than her, maybe 15 or 16, with the look of someone who slept outdoors more than in. The circuit preacher had just delivered a sermon about charity, and the boy had listened from the fence with an expression Phoebe had recognized even then as the particular blankness of someone who had stopped expecting things. She had walked over to him and asked if he was hungry. He had looked at her as though the question confused him. She had given him the biscuit she'd been saving from the church supper. He had reached into his jacket and pressed something into her hand. A spinning top, hand-carved, with a ring of stars burned around the middle. She had lost it 2 moves later, somewhere between Dunning and the Gasconade Valley. Phoebe stared at the top in her palm. She looked toward the door. When Caden came in that evening and saw her standing at the stove with the top in her hand, he stopped. The stillness in the room became immediate and total, as though the air itself had rearranged around something that mattered. He did not speak first. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, moved to the wash basin, took more time than necessary cleaning the trail dust from his hands. "Dunning," Phoebe said. Her voice was quiet and very steady. "The Methodist Church. 1872. Caden dried his hands. He turned to face her. "You gave me your biscuit," he said. It was the most personal thing he had said to her in 2 weeks. His voice was different saying it. Rougher somehow, the practiced flatness of it worn away. "You gave me your top," she said, "and then you were gone. My father was a circuit laborer." He moved to the table and sat down, though he did not look at his hands this time. He looked at her. "We followed the harvest work. When it ran out, he drank what we'd earned and moved on. I left the circuit when I was 17. Went north. Learned surveying from a federal man who needed a chain carrier and didn't ask too many questions about my age. You recognized me, Phoebe said. Not an accusation, a realization settling into place. In Garland's Crossing, before Fitch, you recognized me. He nodded once. I came through the crossing 2 months ago. I saw you outside the milliner's with your mother. He was quiet for a moment. I heard Fitch in the land office the following week. Heard what he was planning, heard the amount. She absorbed this. You spent your survey wages. 8 months of contract work, he said, not with self-pity, simply as a fact. You spent 8 months of wages on a girl you knew for 10 minutes 11 years ago. You didn't hesitate, he said. When you walked over to me, most people looked right past me. You walked over and asked if I was hungry, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He paused. I've thought about that more times than I can count. The fire snapped in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the hickory trees on the ridge. Phoebe set the spinning top down on the table between them. That was a kind thing you did, she said finally. What you paid, what you gave up. You would have done the same. I don't have 8 months of wages. Something shifted in his face then. It was not quite a smile. His face had clearly forgotten the mechanics of smiling somewhere in the last decade, but it was the beginning of one. Winter closed in around the cabin above Repton Creek with the slow, suffocating patience of a season that intended to be thorough. The first serious snow fell in mid-November and did not stop until the trail down to the valley floor was buried under 3 feet of solid white silence. They were, to all practical purposes, alone, and the strangeness of the situation, its awkwardness, its fundamental wrongness, began to quietly dissolve. He taught her to read a survey chain and to use a hand compass in the woods. She taught him to bake cornbread that didn't come out like a brick, a skill he received with grave seriousness and applied with some effort. She read aloud in the evenings from a collection of John Muir's nature essays she found on his shelf. He listened with the absolute concentrated attention of a man who had spent too long with no one to talk to. He did not crowd her. He did not make demands, but he was there, steadily and reliably there, in the way that good things in a person's life tend to be, unremarkable until you notice their absence. She noticed, somewhere in December, that she had stopped bolting the door at night. The breaking of their winter peace came without ceremony on a gray Tuesday morning in January. Phoebe was outside splitting kindling near the woodpile when she heard horses on the south trail. She set the hatchet down slowly. The sound was wrong, too many animals, moving with the particular deliberateness of riders who were not lost and were not in a hurry. Caden was a mile down the creek checking his survey stakes. She was alone. She counted 4 horses as they came through the tree line into the clearing. The men riding them wore the flat expressions of people who did work they were paid for and did not spend time thinking about it. The one in front she recognized. It was one of Fitch's escorts from the farmhouse in October. He had a thin scar bisecting his left eyebrow and the kind of patience in his eyes that came from being hired by careful men. His name, she would learn later, was Denton Reese. We're not looking for trouble, Reese said from the saddle, scanning the cabin and the outbuilding and the empty yard. Mr. Fitch sent us to collect the surveyor's field notes. There's a land parcel up here that Mr. Fitch has a competing claim on, and he believes Mr. Voss's survey data supports his case. We'll take the notebooks and leave. Phoebe looked at him with the steady, careful attention she had learned to apply to things that frightened her. Mr. Voss isn't here, she said. We'll wait then. Reese swung down from his horse. The notebooks aren't here either, she said. He keeps his field work at the land office in Repton. This was not entirely true. Caden kept his daily survey logs in a battered leather satchel that was currently on the shelf above the stove. She had read enough of them to understand that they documented, in careful and legally significant detail, the exact boundaries of 3 land parcels in the hill country above Repton Creek. Parcels that Cornelius Fitch was trying to claim through a set of fraudulent preemption filings that several Valley families had already lost sleep over. Reese studied her. He was not stupid. Stupid men did not last long in Fitch's employ. "You mind if we come inside and have a look?" "I do mind," Phoebe said. He took a step forward. She was already moving. She went in through the back door, crossed to the stove, and had the Springfield rifle down from the wall rack and a cartridge chambered before she heard boots on the porch. She pressed her back against the wall beside the front window and waited. The door opened. Reese came in first, and he stopped when he saw the rifle leveled at the center of his chest. "The notebooks aren't here," Phoebe said again. Her voice was calm in the way that very cold water is calm, perfectly still on top and moving hard underneath. "You can look if you need to be sure, but you'll do it one at a time, with your gun belts on the floor, and when you don't find them, you'll leave." A long beat passed. Reese looked at her face. He looked at the rifle. He made the calculation that men make when they are being paid to collect paper and not to be shot. "Put them down," he said to his men, without turning around. 2 gun belts hit the floor. A third. A fourth. They went through the cabin, with the careful, unconvinced manner of men, looking for something they were not entirely sure was there. They did not find the notebooks, because Phoebe had already slid them behind the false back of the water barrel, while Reese was still on the porch. They left without violence and without the notebooks. She was still standing by the front window with the rifle when Caden came in 20 minutes later, stamping the snow off his boots. He read the room in a single sweep, the out-of-place chair, the open cupboard doors, the careful tension in the way she was standing. "Reese," she said before he could ask. "4 men. Fitch sent them for your survey logs." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not relief exactly. It was something deeper than that, something with more history in it. "Where are the logs?" he asked. She retrieved them from behind the water barrel and held them out. He took the satchel, and then he did something unexpected. He sat down at the table, opened the satchel, and spread the notebooks out in front of him. He looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her. "These surveys," he said, "document Fitch's land fraud. Specifically, 3 preemption claims he filed in 1881 on land that was already settled and improved. 4 families in the valley have been paying him rent on property they legally own. If these reach the federal land office in Jefferson City, Fitch loses everything. The claims, the rents, the credibility he uses to extend his money-lending operation." Phoebe sat down across from him. "He'll come back, he will, with more men, yes." She looked at the notebooks. Then she looked at him. "How long would it take to get to Jefferson City?" He paused. 4 days in good weather, 6 in the snows. "Then we should leave tomorrow," she said. He looked at her steadily, and she understood for the first time the full weight of what he had carried by himself for a decade. Not just the solitude, but the refusal of it, the way he had gone on working and noting and documenting things that mattered, even when there was no one beside him to confirm that they mattered. "We," he said. "You don't speak bureaucratic," she said. "I grew up watching my father argue with county clerks. I know how to make a case in a land office." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The top was a fair trade." She didn't sleep much that night, but not from fear. She lay in the cot in the sleeping room and listened to the wind work over the roof shingles and thought about the particular mathematics of a life. The way a 10-minute conversation on a church step in 1872 could move through the years like an underground stream, invisible and constant, until one October afternoon it came up through the ground and changed everything. They left at first light. The road to Jefferson City through the Ozark winter was everything it had promised to be. Punishing and slow and beautiful in the way that hard things sometimes are, when you are traveling them with the right person. The temperature stayed below freezing for 3 of the 4 days. They rode close together on the narrow trails where the tree cover broke the wind, and far apart on the open ridges where the footing was uncertain. She rode her mule and he rode the iron-gray horse, and they talked more in those 4 days than they had in 2 months in the cabin. He told her about the river towns he had worked in. She told him about the years of moving, of learning which schools would take a girl through the end of the term before her family pulled up stakes again, of reading every book she could get her hands on because books were lighter than furniture and could come with her. He listened with the same concentrated attention he gave to everything. On the third evening, camped in a shallow valley out of the worst of the wind, she told him about her mother's lungs. He did not offer comfort in the form of empty assurances. He said, "She sounds like a woman who knew what she was doing when she told you to go." It was, somehow, the most comforting thing anyone had said to her about it. They reached Jefferson City on the fourth afternoon. The federal land office was a sober brick building 2 blocks from the State House, staffed by clerks with ink-stained fingers and the unhurried manner of men who dealt daily with the permanent record of things. Phoebe had spent the last 2 evenings reviewing Caden's survey notebooks by firelight, and she understood them well enough to present the core of the matter clearly. It took the better part of 2 days. The chief land examiner, a deliberate man named Hargrove, who wore spectacles on a chain and did not appear to be impressed by anything, listened to Phoebe's presentation of the survey discrepancies with careful attention. He compared the field notebooks against the filings in the federal record. He asked precise questions and received precise answers. At the end of the second afternoon, Hargrove set his spectacles down on his desk. "The Fitch preemption claims," he said, in the measured tone of a man announcing a fact rather than a decision, "are fraudulent on their face. The survey documentation provided by Mr. Voss establishes the prior settlement dates of all 3 parcels beyond reasonable dispute. I will refer this matter to the Federal District Attorney's Office in St. Louis." He looked at Caden over the edge of his spectacle chain. "Your survey contract will be renewed, Mr. Voss, with an enhanced rate commensurate with the scope of the documentation." He looked at Phoebe, "and the 4 families currently paying rent to Mr. Fitch on those parcels," he said, "should be advised that they are entitled to a full recovery of those payments." Phoebe thought about 4 families in the valley below Repton Creek who had been paying a grasping man money they did not owe for land they already owned. She thought about her father standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. She thought about Cornelius Fitch's thin smile when he pocketed 8 months of survey wages. "I'll advise them," she said. Caden said nothing. He was watching her face. They rode back to the cabin above Repton Creek in 5 days, the return trip slower, because they carried supplies purchased in Jefferson City with the advance on the renewed survey contract. The wait was comfortable in the way that practical things are comfortable, real, manageable, purposeful. On the last evening before they reached the cabin, they stopped where the trail broke above the tree line and the full sweep of the Ozark Hill country opened out below them in the blue winter dusk. The creek was visible far down the valley, a dark thread through the white. Smoke would be rising from the cabin chimney soon, once they got the fire going. The horizon was clear, the sky the particular deep orange that comes before very cold nights. Phoebe looked at it for a long time. She thought about the girl who had stood at her parents' farmhouse window 9 months ago and watched a stranger throw a pouch of silver coin at Cornelius Fitch's feet. She barely recognized that girl now, not because she had become someone different, but because she had become more entirely who she already was. "My father is going to want to meet you," she said. Caden looked sideways at her. "Is that a warning?" "It's information," she said. "He'll ask you about your survey work for approximately 3 hours, and then he'll ask you your intentions, and whether you own a Bible. I own 2. That'll satisfy him." A pause opened between them, easy and warm the way silences between people can become when they have been through something together. "The land office will send a court rider to the valley in the spring," Caden said, "to process the family claims. The families will have a clear title by summer." "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Fitch will be indicted. He won't be in a position to threaten anyone on the Gasconade for a long time. I know. She reached into her coat pocket and found the spinning top which she had been carrying there since November. She held it out to him on her palm. I've been thinking, she said, that you should have this back. He looked at it. He looked at her. Why? Because I think you've been holding on to it long enough, she said, and I know where to find you now. Caden Voss, who had spent 11 years moving through the hill country alone, with the careful, considered silence of a man who had given up expecting things, reached out and took the top from her hand. He turned it once between his fingers. He looked at the ring of small burned stars around its middle. Then he put it in his own pocket. Come on then, he said, turning his horse toward the trail. The fire won't start itself. They rode down together into the valley, into the last red light of the winter afternoon, and neither of them looked back at the ridge.